She fled into the snow with her baby. Then a lonely rancher wrapped them in his coat. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, driving snow horizontally through the darkness. Sarah Fletcher pressed her daughter closer to her chest, feeling the infant's tiny body shivering through the thin blanket that was all she'd managed to grab before fleeing. Her own coat, threadbare and inadequate against the February cold, offered little protection as she stumbled through knee-deep drifts. Behind her, somewhere in the swirling white, Thomas Fletcher's voice carried on the wind, calling her name, promising forgiveness one moment and damnation the next. She knew better than to believe either. The bruises on her ribs, still tender from 3 days ago, reminded her of Thomas's version of forgiveness. The split lip she'd received for talking back when she'd asked for money to buy proper winter clothes for baby Mary was his idea of gentle correction. Sarah's boots, cracked leather that let in more snow than they kept out, slipped on the icy ground beneath the snow. She caught herself against a fence post, gasping as the frozen wood burned her bare hand. She'd left her gloves behind, along with everything else that might have helped her survive this night. All that mattered was getting Mary away from the man who'd already begun to look at their 6-month-old daughter with the same possessive anger he'd once directed solely at Sarah. The baby's cry was weak. Now, barely audible above the storm, Sarah tried to shield her daughter's face from the driving snow, but her own body heat was fading fast. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and she could no longer feel her feet. She'd been walking for what felt like hours, following the fence line that she hoped would lead to the Hendricks place. But the storm had disoriented her. Nothing looked familiar in this white hell. "Please," she whispered to the wind, to God, to anyone who might be listening. "Please don't let her die because of my choices." The fence post she'd been following suddenly ended, leaving her standing in an open expanse with no landmarks to guide her. Panic rose in her throat like bile. She turned in a circle, trying to spot anything. A building, another fence, even the outline of trees, but saw only the endless dance of snow in the darkness. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the drift. Mary's cries had stopped entirely, and Sarah's heart hammered with terror. As she pulled back the blanket to check on her daughter, the baby's lips held a bluish tinge that made Sarah's blood turn to ice water. "No, no, no," Sarah breathed, pulling Mary closer and trying to warm her with what little body heat she had left. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Please stay with me." That's when she heard it, not Thomas's voice this time, but the low lowing of cattle somewhere ahead. Where there were cattle, there might be shelter, there might be help. Sarah forced herself to stand, her legs shaking with cold and exhaustion, and stumbled toward the sound. The cattle were huddled against what appeared to be a wooden structure. As Sarah drew closer, she could make out the outline of a barn, solid and real against the storm. Behind it, barely visible through the snow, she glimpsed the warm yellow glow of lamplight in windows. She'd found a ranch. Sarah's relief was so overwhelming that she nearly collapsed again, but Mary's stillness in her arms drove her forward. She half ran, half stumbled toward the house, her frozen feet catching in the snow with each step. The porch, when she finally reached it, felt like salvation itself, solid wood beneath her feet, and a roof overhead that blocked the worst of the wind. She pounded on the door with numb fists, not caring about propriety or the late hour. "Please," she called out, her voice hoarse from the cold. "Please, I have a baby." For a long moment there was only silence from within. Then she heard heavy footsteps. Approaching the door, a man's voice, cautious but not unkind, called out, "Who's there?" "My name is Sarah Fletcher," she managed through chattering teeth. "I have my baby with me. We're caught in the storm. Please." The door opened, flooding the porch with warm lamplight that made Sarah squint after so long in the darkness. The man silhouetted in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face that spoke of long hours under the sun. His eyes, when they focused on her, widened with shock. "Dear God," he breathed, and without another word he stepped forward and wrapped his heavy coat around both Sarah and Mary, enveloping them in blessed warmth that still held the scent of leather and wood smoke. "Come inside. Quickly now." Jacob Morrison had been prepared for many things when the pounding on his door roused him from his evening reading. Perhaps a neighbor in trouble, or even cattle rustlers hoping to catch him off guard. He had not been prepared for a half-frozen woman clutching an infant, both of them blue with cold and close to death. As he guided them into his kitchen, settling them near the wood stove that threw blessed heat into the room, Jake found himself moving with an efficiency born of necessity. He'd delivered calves in blizzards, treated frostbite on his hands, and survived 3 Wyoming winters alone on this ranch. But the sight of this woman and child, so close to death on his doorstep, stirred something in him that had been dormant for years. "The baby," Sarah whispered urgently, pulling back the blanket to reveal Mary's too still form. "Please, she's so cold, I don't think she's—" Jake knelt beside them, his calloused fingers gentle as he checked the infant's pulse. It was there, weak but steady. "She's alive," he said firmly, meeting Sarah's desperate eyes. "We're going to warm her up slowly. Too fast and we could hurt her." He moved efficiently around the kitchen, stoking the fire higher and setting water to heat on the stove. From his bedroom he brought every blanket he owned, creating a warm nest near the stove, where Sarah could hold her daughter while they both thawed out. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, as he knelt beside them again, this time with warm towels to wrap around Mary's tiny limbs. "Jacob Morrison," he replied, his hand steady as he worked. "Jake, and you said Fletcher?" Something flickered across Sarah's face at the name. Fear, maybe, or shame. "Yes, Sarah Fletcher. This is Mary." Jake nodded, not pressing for more information. He'd lived on the frontier long enough to know that people sometimes had good reasons for being where they shouldn't be. The important thing now was making sure this woman and her child survived the night. As the warmth of the room began to seep into their frozen bodies, Mary stirred in her mother's arms and let out a weak but healthy cry. Sarah's sob of relief was so profound that Jake had to look away, something tight squeezing in his chest at the raw emotion. "She's gonna be all right," he said quietly, more to himself than to Sarah. But as he watched the young mother hold her daughter close, tears streaming down her face in the lamplight, Jake realized that whatever had driven them out into that storm, their arrival on his doorstep was about to change everything. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the kitchen of the Morrison Ranch, 3 people who had been strangers an hour ago began the slow process of saving each other's lives. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Morrison Ranch, the storm having finally exhausted itself during the early morning hours. Jake stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun struggle through the heavy clouds, while behind him Sarah Fletcher slept in his chair by the stove, her daughter finally peaceful in her arms. He dozed fitfully through the night in his bedroom, waking every hour to check on his unexpected guests. Each time he'd found Sarah awake, watching over Mary with the fierce vigilance of a mother who'd nearly lost everything. Now, as the first real light touched the snow-covered plains, both mother and child had finally surrendered to exhaustion. Jake studied Sarah's face in the gentle morning light. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 22 or 23, with brown hair that had escaped its braid during their ordeal, and now fell in waves around her shoulders. Even in sleep there was a tension about her, as if she were ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. It was the bruises that made Jake's jaw tighten with anger. Now that she was warm and the immediate crisis had passed, he could see them clearly. The fading yellow-green mark along her jaw, the darker bruise on her collarbone that disappeared beneath her worn dress. Someone had been hurting this woman, and Jake had a pretty good idea who. Thomas Fletcher was known throughout the territory, though not well liked. He ran cattle on a spread about 15 miles south of Jake's place, and the few times Jake had encountered him in town, Fletcher had struck him as the kind of man who mistook cruelty for strength. Jake had never heard Fletcher mention a wife, but then again, Fletcher wasn't the sort to speak of family unless it served his purposes. Mary stirred in her mother's arms, making small sounds that indicated she'd be ready to eat soon. Jake moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing breakfast and trying not to wake Sarah just yet. She needed the rest, and he needed time to think about what came next. He couldn't send them back out into the cold, that much was certain, but harboring another man's wife and child, even temporarily, could bring trouble to his door. The sound of approaching horses cut through his thoughts. Jake set down his coffee and moved to the window, his hand automatically going to the rifle that hung above the door. 3 riders were making their way up his lane, their horses picking carefully through the deep snow. Even at a distance, Jake recognized the lead rider's posture and the aggressive set of his shoulders. Thomas Fletcher had come calling. "Sarah, Jake's voice was quiet but urgent. "Sarah, wake up." Her eyes snapped open immediately, alert in the way of someone accustomed to danger. She saw Jake's expression and looked toward the window, and the color drained from her face. "He found us," she whispered, holding Mary closer. "How many men does he usually ride with?" Jake asked, checking his rifle. "2 or 3, they're not bad men, just they work for him. They do what he says." Sarah stood unsteadily, still weak from her ordeal. "I should go with him. I shouldn't have brought this trouble to your door." "Like hell you will." The words came out harder than Jake intended, but he didn't take them back. "No woman and child leaves my house to go back to that." He gestured toward her bruises. Sarah's hand went instinctively to her jaw. "You don't understand. Thomas doesn't take kindly to interference. He could make things very difficult for you. Let me worry about that." Jake moved to the door, then paused. "Is there somewhere you can go? Family? Friends? My sister lives in Denver, but..." Sarah shook her head. "I don't have money for train fare, and Thomas would find me long before I could get there." The sound of boots on the porch steps interrupted them. Jake motioned for Sarah to move away from the window, then opened the door before Fletcher could knock. Thomas Fletcher was a big man, built like a bull with small eyes and the kind of smile that never reached them. His 2 companions flanked him on either side, cowhands Jake recognized from town but didn't know by name. "Morrison," Fletcher said without preamble. "I'm looking for my wife, trail-led here through the snow." "Mr. Fletcher." Jake's voice was carefully neutral. "Terrible storm last night. I hope your cattle came through all right." Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me." "Morrison, Sarah took my daughter and ran off in the storm. Nearly got them both killed with her foolishness. I've come to take them home." "I can see how you'd be worried," Jake replied evenly, "but I haven't seen anyone matching that description." It was a careful choice of words, and Fletcher caught the distinction immediately. His face darkened with anger. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm saying I haven't seen anyone matching your description," Jake repeated. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He started to close the door, but Fletcher's boot stopped it. "I know she's here, Morrison. Her tracks lead right to your door. Storm could have blown all kinds of tracks around." Jake's hand rested casually near his sidearm. Lot of confusion in weather like that. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Fletcher was bigger, but Jake had the advantage of position and local reputation. Everyone in the territory knew Jacob Morrison as a fair man, but also one you didn't cross lightly. "This isn't over," Fletcher said finally, pulling his boot back. "I'll get the sheriff involved if I have to. Sarah is my wife, and that's my child. No court in the territory will side with a stranger over a husband's rights." "Court would have to prove they were here first," Jake replied mildly. "And like I said, I haven't seen anyone matching your description." Fletcher's face went red with fury, but he turned away without another word. Jake watched until the 3 riders disappeared down his lane before closing and barring the door. When he turned back, Sarah was standing by the stove, tears streaming down her face. "He's right," she said quietly. "The law is on his side. I'm his wife. Mary is his daughter. It doesn't matter what he's done to us." Jake crossed to her, his expression grim but determined. "Maybe so, but this is still my property, and I still say who's welcome here and who isn't. Thomas Fletcher isn't welcome. You can't fight the law for us. It's not fair to ask that of you. You didn't ask, I'm offering." Jake looked down at Mary, who was watching him with solemn dark eyes. "Besides, seems to me you might have other options." Sarah looked at him questioningly. "Your sister in Denver. What if you had train fare?" "I told you, I don't have..." "I do." Jake's words were quiet but firm. "I've got money saved, enough to get you and Mary to Denver and help you get started there." Sarah stared at him in shock. "Why? Why would you do that for strangers?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the snow-covered landscape where Fletcher's tracks were already being covered by drifting snow. "Maybe because I know what it's like to need help and not have anywhere to turn," he said finally. "Maybe because no child should grow up afraid of their own father." He met her eyes. "Or maybe because some things are just right, and helping you is one of them." Sarah's tears came fresh then, but they were different tears. Not the desperate, frightened tears of the night before, but the overwhelming relief of someone who had been drowning and suddenly found solid ground beneath their feet. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Jake replied practically. We still have to get you to the train station without Fletcher knowing, and that's going to take some planning." As if summoned by his words, Mary began to fuss, reminding them both that whatever plans they made, they had to account for the needs of a 6-month-old baby. Jake found himself smiling as Sarah moved to feed her daughter, struck by how quickly this house had gone from empty to full of life. Outside, the sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. It was going to be a clear day, good traveling weather when the time came. Jake began mentally calculating distances and timing, planning a route that would get Sarah and Mary safely to the train station in Cheyenne. He'd lived alone on this ranch for 5 years, and until yesterday, he'd thought he preferred it that way. But as he watched Sarah tend to her daughter in the warm kitchen light, Jake realized that some things were worth the risk of changing everything you thought you knew about your own life. The question now was whether he'd have the courage to see it through. The plan Jake devised was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. They would wait 3 days for Fletcher to assume Sarah had moved on, then Jake would drive them to Cheyenne in his wagon under cover of darkness. The 15-mile journey would take most of the night, giving them time to catch the early morning train to Denver before Fletcher realized they were gone. What Jake hadn't anticipated was how those 3 days of waiting would change everything. Sarah proved to be more than just a victim seeking rescue. On the second morning, Jake woke to find her in his kitchen, having somehow managed to prepare breakfast while keeping Mary quiet and content. The sight of his table set with his own dishes, steam rising from fresh biscuits and coffee, stopped him in his tracks. "You didn't have to do this," he said, though the warmth in his voice contradicted any protest. "You saved our lives," Sarah replied, settling Mary in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from one of Jake's wood crates and several blankets. "The least I can do is earn my keep while we're here." Jake sat down to the best meal he'd had in months, watching Sarah move efficiently around his kitchen as if she belonged there. She had a way of bringing order to spaces that made them feel more like homes than just places to sleep and eat. Even Mary seemed to sense the change, crying less and sleeping more peacefully than she had since their arrival. "Tell me about your sister," Jake said over his second cup of coffee. "Emma?" Sarah's face brightened. "She's 3 years older than me, married to a good man named Robert who works for the railroad. They have 2 children of their own, a boy and a girl. Emma always said if I ever needed anything." She trailed off, her expression growing sad. "I should have gone to her when things started getting bad with Thomas. I just kept thinking I could fix it somehow." "What made you finally leave?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He started looking at Mary the same way he used to look at me, before we were married, when he was still trying to win me over. That hungry, possessive look." She shuddered. "She's just a baby, but I could see it in his eyes. The way he'd talk about her growing up, about how she'd need to learn to obey him, to respect his authority, and the way he'd hold her." Sarah's hands were shaking now, and Jake reached across the table to cover them with his own. "You did the right thing," he said firmly. Getting her away from that was the right thing. The touch of his calloused hand over hers was gentle, protective without being possessive. Sarah looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time since that desperate night on his porch. Jacob Morrison was probably 35, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from honest work under the open sky. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of storm clouds, and when he looked at her there was no judgment in them, only kindness. His hands were scarred from ranch work, but gentle when he held Mary, which he'd done several times when Sarah needed to rest. "What about you?" she asked softly. "You live here alone, but this house, it feels like it was built for a family." Jake's expression grew distant. "It was. I built it 7 years ago for my wife, Margaret. We planned to fill it with children." He was quiet for a moment. "She died of fever the winter after we were married. The baby we were expecting died with her." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, understanding now the shadows she sometimes saw in his eyes. "It was a long time ago." Jake pulled his hands back, but gently. "I kept thinking someday I'd marry again, but I guess I got comfortable with the quiet." They spent the rest of that day in easy companionship. Jake showed Sarah around the ranch, pointing out the places where snow had damaged fence lines that would need repair come spring. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood the hard work and planning that went into making a living from the land. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Sarah mending one of Jake's shirts while he whittled a small wooden toy for Mary, the domesticity of the scene felt so natural that they both found themselves stealing glances at each other when they thought the other wasn't looking. "Jake," Sarah said suddenly, setting down her sewing, "when I get to Denver, how will I ever repay you for what you've done? You don't need to repay anything." "Yes, I do. The money for the train tickets alone." Sarah, Jake, set down his whittling and looked at her directly. "I've got more money than I know what to do with. This ranch does well, and I live simply. What good is it doing just sitting in the bank? But you could use it to expand your herd or improve the house, or I could use it to help someone who needs it more than I need another acre of grazing land." Jake's voice was firm but not unkind. Some things matter more than money. The third day brought unexpected complications. Jake was checking his cattle when he spotted smoke rising from the direction of Fletcher's ranch. By afternoon, word had spread throughout the area that Thomas Fletcher's barn had burned down in the night, and Fletcher was claiming it was arson. "Revenge," he said, by whoever was harboring his missing wife. Jake returned to the house to find Sarah pacing anxiously, Mary fussing in her arms. "He's going to use this as an excuse to get the sheriff involved," she said, before Jake could even speak. "He'll claim you, burned his barn, and then Sheriff Coleman will have to investigate. Thomas contributes heavily to Coleman's re-election campaigns." Jake nodded grimly. He'd already reached the same conclusion. "We leave tonight, early, before full dark. It's risky traveling with Mary in the cold, but it's riskier staying here." They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing. Jake hitched his strongest horse to the wagon and loaded it with blankets, warm bricks heated by the fire, and enough supplies for the journey. Sarah wrapped Mary in every warm garment they could find, creating layers that would protect the baby from the frigid night air. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Jake found himself reluctant to begin the journey that would take Sarah and Mary out of his life forever. The past 3 days had shown him what his house could be with the right people in it, and the thought of returning to the solitude he'd once treasured now felt like a kind of death. "Ready?" he asked as Sarah settled into the wagon seat beside him, Mary bundled securely in her arms. "Ready," she replied, but her voice caught slightly on the word. They rode in comfortable silence for the first few miles, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the steady breathing of the horse. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to make travel possible but creating shadows that could hide watchers. It was Sarah who finally broke the silence. "Jake," she said, quietly, "these past 3 days, they've been the happiest I've been in years. Even with all the fear and uncertainty, being in your house, feeling safe, watching you with Mary, it felt like what a family should be." Jake's hands tightened on the reins. "For me, too. When I get to Denver, when I'm settled with Emma, would you consider visiting sometime? I know it's a long way to travel, but..." "Sarah," Jake's voice was rough with emotion, "there's something I need to ask you, and I need to ask it now, before we get to Cheyenne and it's too late." He pulled the wagon to a stop in a sheltered grove of trees and turned to face her fully. "Stay," he said simply. "Don't get on that train. Stay with me." Sarah's breath caught. "Jake, I can't. Thomas will never stop looking for us. He'll make your life miserable. And the law says you're his wife until you're legally divorced. There are lawyers in Denver who handle such things. Lawyers who know how to build cases against men like Fletcher. But there are also lawyers right here in Wyoming who could do the same thing." Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden object, the toy he'd been carving by the fire the night before. It was a small horse, perfectly proportioned and smooth as silk. "I made this for Mary," he said, placing it gently in Sarah's free hand. "But I realized as I was making it that I wasn't just carving a toy. I was carving a piece of my heart to give to both of you. These 3 days, having you both in my house, have shown me what I want my life to be." Sarah stared down at the wooden horse, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow," Jake continued. "I know you need time to heal, time to be free of Fletcher legally and emotionally. But I'm asking you to let me help you through that. Let me give you and Mary a home where you can be safe while you rebuild your lives. And when you're ready, If you're ever ready, maybe we can build something together." Sarah looked up at him, this man who had saved their lives and was now offering them so much more than rescue. In the moonlight, his face was earnest and hopeful, and completely honest. "What if Fletcher comes after us? What if he brings the sheriff and makes trouble for you? Then we'll face it together." Jake's voice was steady and sure. "I'm not afraid of Thomas Fletcher or any man like him. This is my land, and I choose who I share it with." Mary stirred in Sarah's arms, making small sounds that were almost like approval. Sarah looked down at her daughter, then back at Jake, and for the first time since her marriage to Thomas Fletcher, she felt truly free to choose her own future. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, we'll stay." Jake's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, a promise of protection and possibility. "Then let's go home," he said, turning the wagon around. As they drove back toward the Morrison ranch under the bright moon, all three of them riding toward an uncertain but hopeful future. None of them noticed the lone rider who had been following them at a distance, watching and waiting for his moment to strike. Thomas Fletcher had been watching the Morrison ranch for 2 days, and his patience was wearing thin. He'd seen the smoke from his own barn rising in the distance, set deliberately to create the chaos he needed, and now Sheriff Coleman was asking uncomfortable questions about his missing wife and the man harboring her. From his position in the tree line, Fletcher could see warm light glowing in Morrison's windows, and the sight filled him with rage. His wife was in there, playing house with another man, making a mockery of their marriage vows and his authority. The humiliation burned in his chest like acid. He'd tried the legal route first, but Coleman had proved frustratingly unwilling to simply march onto Morrison's property without evidence. "Being married don't give you the right to trespass on another man's land," the sheriff had said. "You want your wife back, you prove she's there first." So Fletcher had taken matters into his own hands. He'd sent his hired men back to town with orders to establish his alibi, while he tracked Morrison's wagon to Cheyenne and back. Now he knew Sarah was definitely at the Morrison place, and he had a plan to get her back that didn't require the sheriff's cooperation. The plan was simple: wait until Morrison was away from the house, then take Sarah and the baby back by force. Morrison couldn't report the kidnapping of another man's wife and child without admitting he'd been hiding them illegally. It was perfect. What Fletcher hadn't counted on was how much 3 days of safety and kindness had changed Sarah Fletcher. Jake left the ranch early that morning to check on his cattle in the far pasture, a routine he'd followed for years. But today, something made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way the horses had been, restless in the barn, or the fact that the local crows seemed agitated, but he found himself hurrying through his inspection and heading home earlier than planned. He was halfway back to the house when he heard Sarah scream. Jake spurred his horse into a dead run, his heart hammering with fear and rage. As he crested the hill above his ranch, he could see Fletcher's bulky form dragging Sarah toward a horse while she fought desperately to hold on to Mary. "Let them go, Fletcher," Jake's voice carried across the yard as he leaped from his horse, rifle in hand. Fletcher spun around, using Sarah as a shield between himself and Jake's weapon. "This is my wife, Morrison. My child. You got no right to interfere. I got every right to protect people on my land." Jake kept the rifle trained on Fletcher, but the man's cowardly use of Sarah as a human shield made a clean shot impossible. "Thomas, please," Sarah gasped, struggling against his grip while trying to protect Mary from being crushed between them. "You're hurting her!" "Shut up!" Fletcher backhanded her, the blow snapping her head to the side and drawing blood from her lip. "You've caused enough trouble with your selfishness." The sight of Fletcher striking Sarah while she held their baby ignited something primal in Jake. He'd been raised to respect the law, to solve problems through reason and discussion, but watching this brute hurt a woman and child stripped away years of civilized restraint. "That's the last time you'll ever hit her," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. Fletcher laughed, a ugly sound that held no humor. "You think you can threaten me, Morrison? I got rights here, legal rights. She's coming home with me and there ain't nothing you can do about it." "Maybe not legally," Jake admitted, "but I notice you didn't bring the sheriff with you this time. Funny thing about that, makes me think maybe your legal rights ain't as solid as you claim." Fletcher's face darkened. "I don't need Coleman to collect my own property." "Property?" Sarah's voice was stronger now, anger replacing fear. I'm not your property, Thomas. Neither is Mary. The hell you ain't. You're my wife, bought and paid for with a ring and legal ceremony. You took vows to obey me, and by God you will. I took vows to love and honor you, Sarah shot back. But you broke those vows long ago when you decided love meant ownership and honor meant fear. Fletcher's grip tightened on her arm, making her wince. Fancy words. Won't change the law. You're coming home, and Morrison here is going to mind his own business if he knows what's good for him. Jake took a step closer, the rifle never wavering. Here's what's going to happen, Fletcher. You're going to let Sarah and Mary go. Then you're going to get on your horse and ride away. And if you ever set foot on my land again, or if you ever hurt either of them again, I will kill you. You threatening me? I'm making you a promise. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the snowy yard, the tension thick enough to cut. Fletcher was bigger and meaner, but Jake had the advantage of position, and more importantly, righteous fury. It was Mary who broke the standoff. The baby, frightened by the shouting and violence, began crying. Not the fussy complaints Jake had grown accustomed to, but the terrified wails of a child in distress. The sound seemed to galvanize Sarah, who stopped struggling against Fletcher's grip and instead focused all her energy on protecting her daughter. Thomas, she said, her voice cutting through Mary's cries with startling clarity. Look at her. Look at what you're doing to your own child. Despite himself, Fletcher glanced down at the baby in Sarah's arms. Mary's face was red with crying, her small fists waving helplessly as she expressed the only way she could her terror and confusion. She's afraid of you, Sarah continued, her voice gentle but implacable. Your own daughter is afraid of you. Is that what you want? Is that the kind of father you want to be? For just a moment, something flickered across Fletcher's face. Doubt, maybe, or the ghost of whatever conscience he'd once possessed. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the familiar mask of anger and control. She'll learn respect, he said harshly. Just like you will. No. Sarah's voice was quiet but absolutely certain. She won't. Because I won't let her grow up afraid the way I did. I won't let her think that love looks like this. She stopped struggling then, standing perfectly still in Fletcher's grip, and when she spoke again, her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. If you take us back, Thomas, I will run again, and again, and again. Every time you turn your back, every time you leave the house, I will take Mary and I will run. You can beat me, you can lock me up, you can threaten me with hell itself, but I will never stop trying to get her away from you. Fletcher's face went white with rage. You swore before God. I swore to love and honor you, and I tried. God knows I tried, but you made it impossible. Sarah's eyes found Jake across the yard, drawing strength from his steady presence. I won't let Mary grow up thinking this is what marriage looks like. I won't let her think this is what love looks like. You ain't got a choice. Yes, I do. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. I can choose to fight. I can choose to run. I can choose to die before I let you turn my daughter into another victim. That's my choice, Thomas, and I choose to fight. Fletcher's control finally snapped completely. With a roar of rage, he shoved Sarah away from him so violently that she stumbled and nearly fell. But instead of reaching for his gun, he lunged toward Jake, apparently deciding that removing Morrison from the equation would solve all his problems. It was exactly the mistake Jake had been waiting for. The moment Fletcher released Sarah, Jake's rifle spoke. The shot took Fletcher high in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the snow. The big man clutched his wounded shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers as he stared up at Jake in shock and pain. Jesus, Morrison, you shot me. I could have shot you dead, Jake replied calmly, working the lever to chamber another round. Consider that a warning. Fletcher struggled to his feet, his face pale with pain and shock. You can't. The sheriff will see a man who trespassed on my property and threatened my family, Jake interrupted. Self-defense is legal in Wyoming territory, Fletcher, even against husbands who think they own their wives. She is my wife. Not anymore. The voice came from behind Fletcher, and he spun around to see Sheriff Coleman riding into the yard, his deputy beside him. At least, not legally. Coleman dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene. Fletcher bleeding in the snow, Sarah holding her baby protectively, Jake with his rifle trained on the wounded man. "Sheriff," Fletcher said, relief evident in his voice. "Morrison shot me. I was just trying to collect my wife and—" "Were you now?" Coleman's voice was dry. "That's interesting, Tom, seeing as how your wife filed for divorce in Cheyenne yesterday. Got the papers right here in my saddlebag." Fletcher stared at the sheriff in shock. "That's impossible. She's been here. She's been in Cheyenne, working with a lawyer named Catherine Mills. Seems Mrs. Mills specializes in cases involving difficult marriages." Coleman's eyes fixed on Fletcher with obvious distaste. "Got quite a story to tell, your wife does. About violence, threats, inappropriate behavior toward the child. She's lying. Maybe. But Dr. Henderson in Cheyenne examined her and photographed her injuries. Amazing what some of these new cameras can capture." Coleman pulled out a folded document. "Says here she's seeking divorce on grounds of physical cruelty and abandonment of marital duties. Also says she fears for her life and the life of her child." Jake felt a wave of confusion. "Sheriff, I don't understand. Sarah's been here." "No, Mr. Morrison, she hasn't." Coleman's voice was kind but firm. "According to these papers, Mrs. Fletcher has been in Cheyenne for 3 days, staying at the Frontier Hotel and working with her lawyer. Got witnesses who will swear to it." Sarah stepped forward then, Mary still in her arms, and Jake saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before, a quiet, fierce satisfaction. "I may have been at the Morrison Ranch, Sheriff," she said carefully, "but Sarah Fletcher was definitely in Cheyenne. Amazing how much a woman can accomplish when she puts her mind to it." Understanding dawned on Jake's face. While he'd thought Sarah was hiding at his ranch, she'd somehow managed to travel to Cheyenne, file legal papers, establish witnesses, and build a case against Fletcher, all while making it appear she'd never left his property. "The night we went to Cheyenne," he said slowly. "You didn't just change your mind about the train." "No," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I went to see Mrs. Mills first thing in the morning. She's been building cases against men like Thomas for years. She knew exactly what to do." Fletcher's face was turning red with rage and pain. "This is all lies. Legal tricks. She's still my wife until a judge says otherwise." "Actually," Coleman said, consulting the papers again, "according to this, the divorce was granted yesterday afternoon. Emergency hearing given the circumstances. You're no longer married, Tom, which means you just trespassed on Mr. Morrison's property and threatened a woman and child under his protection." The implications hit Fletcher like a physical blow. Without the legal protection of marriage, his actions became criminal. Trespassing, threats, assault, all charges that could land him in territorial prison. "You can't do this to me," he said, his voice breaking. "I got rights." "You had rights," Coleman corrected. "You chose to abuse them. Now you got consequences." The sheriff turned to Jake. "Mr. Morrison, you want to press charges for trespassing and assault?" Jake looked at Fletcher, bleeding and broken in the snow, then at Sarah holding her daughter. The sight of mother and child finally free and safe made his decision easy. "Yes, Sheriff, I do." As Coleman and his deputy moved to arrest Fletcher, the wounded man made one last desperate attempt to salvage his pride. "This ain't over," he called out to Sarah. "You can't just walk away from a marriage. There's consequences for what you've done." Sarah walked over to where Fletcher knelt in the snow, her steps steady and sure. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had finally found her strength. "You're right, Thomas. There are consequences, but they're not for me anymore. They're for you." She turned away from him then, walking back to Jake with Mary in her arms. As Coleman loaded Fletcher into the wagon that would carry him to jail, Sarah stood beside the man who had saved her life and offered her a future she'd never dared dream of. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. Jake put his arm around her shoulders, careful not to disturb the baby. "It's over. You're free." As they watched the sheriff's wagon disappear down the lane, carrying Thomas Fletcher out of their lives forever, Jake felt Sarah relax against him for the first time since he'd known her. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake looked down at her, this remarkable woman who had found the courage to fight for her freedom and her daughter's future, and smiled. "Now," he said, "we figure out what comes next. Together." The sun was setting over the Morrison Ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. In the distance, cattle lowed peacefully in their winter pasture. and smoke rose from the chimney of the house that was finally, truly, home. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, arriving in March with warm winds that melted the snow and turned the frozen ground into rich, dark earth. Sarah stood at the kitchen window of the Morrison Ranch, watching Jake work with a new foal in the corral, while Mary played contentedly on a blanket spread in the morning sun. 6 months had passed since that terrible night in the storm, and sometimes Sarah had to remind herself that her new life was real. Thomas Fletcher was serving 5 years in territorial prison for assault and trespassing, and the divorce had become final without contest. Sarah Fletcher had ceased to exist, and in her place stood Sarah Morrison, though the name change wouldn't be official until the wedding planned for next month. The transformation hadn't been instant or easy. For weeks after Fletcher's arrest, Sarah had jumped at every unexpected sound, flinched when Jake moved too quickly, and checked the doors and windows obsessively before bed. The habits of fear, built over years of marriage to a violent man, took time to break, but Jake had been patient, never pushing, always giving her space to heal at her own pace. He'd converted his spare room into a proper nursery for Mary, building furniture with his own hands and painting the walls a cheerful yellow. He'd bought Sarah dresses and books, small luxuries she'd forgotten existed. Most importantly, he'd given her time to remember who she was beneath the fear, time to discover what she wanted from life. The person who emerged from that healing was stronger than Sarah had ever imagined she could be. Working with the lawyer, Catherine Mills had awakened something in her, a desire to help other women trapped in situations like hers. She'd begun corresponding with women's rights advocates in Denver and San Francisco, learning about the growing movement to change laws that trapped women in abusive marriages. "Sarah," Jake's voice called from the yard. "Come see this." She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, Mary in her arms. Jake was grinning broadly, standing beside the foal that had been born just a week ago. "Watch this," he said, making a soft clicking sound with his tongue. The foal, still wobbly on its long legs, took a few tentative steps toward Jake. When it reached him, Jake offered his hand, and the little horse nuzzled his palm gently. "He's learning to trust," Jake said, his voice soft with wonder. "Yesterday he wouldn't let me get within 5 feet of him." Sarah smiled, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. Trust was something that had to be earned, day by day, through countless small acts of kindness and consistency. Jake had taught her that, just as he was teaching the foal. "What will you name him?" she asked. Jake looked at the foal, then at Sarah and Mary, his expression thoughtful. "How about Hope? Seems fitting somehow." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. A familiar figure was driving up the lane, Sheriff Coleman, but this time his visit was social rather than official. "Morning, folks," Coleman called out as he climbed down from his wagon. "Beautiful day, ain't it?" "Sheriff," Jake replied, shaking the man's hand. "What brings you out our way?" "Actually, I got some news I thought you'd want to hear." Coleman's expression was serious, but not grim. "Got word from the territorial capital yesterday. There's been some changes in the law regarding divorce proceedings." Sarah felt her heart skip. "What kind of changes?" "Good ones, mostly. The territorial legislature passed a new law making it easier for women to obtain divorces in cases of physical abuse. Also makes it harder for men to contest divorces once they've been granted." Coleman smiled. "Seems there's been quite a bit of pressure from women's advocacy groups. Your case was cited specifically as an example of why the old laws weren't working." Sarah stared at him in amazement. "My case? Mrs. Mills has been using your situation to argue for legal reform. With your permission, of course. She says you've been quite helpful in identifying other women who need assistance." It was true. Over the past months, Sarah had helped Catherine Mills connect with nearly a dozen women in similar situations. Some had been wives of prominent men who thought their status put them above the law. Others had been women too poor or isolated to know they had options. All of them had found the courage to leave because Sarah had shown them it was possible. "There's something else," Coleman continued. "The territorial governor is planning to appoint a commission to study domestic violence and recommend further legal changes. Mrs. Mills suggested you for the commission." Jake's hand found Sarah's, squeezing gently. "That's wonderful news." "It would mean traveling to Cheyenne once a month for meetings," Coleman explained. and probably some correspondence with officials in other territories. But the pay is good, and the work is important. Sarah looked down at Mary, who was reaching for the bright brass buttons on Coleman's vest, then up at Jake. In his eyes, she saw nothing but pride and support. "I'd like to do it," she said firmly. "If it can help other women, then it's settled." Coleman tipped his hat. "I'll tell Mrs. Mills you're interested. She'll be in touch with the details." After the sheriff left, Sarah and Jake stood in their yard, watching Hope the foal play in the sunshine while Mary dozed in Sarah's arms. "Are you sure you're all right with this?" Sarah asked. "The travel, the time away from home?" Jake turned to face her fully, his expression serious but warm. "Sarah, do you remember what you told me that first night when you were afraid I'd send you away?" She shook her head, those early hours still somewhat blurred by cold and fear. "You said please don't let her die because of your choices. You were talking about Mary, but you were also talking about yourself. You'd rather face a blizzard than go back to a life that was killing you both piece by piece." Jake's hands cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You saved yourself and Mary that night, but you didn't stop there. You've spent the last 6 months saving other women too. How could I be anything but proud of that? How could I want to stop you from doing work that's so important?" Tears pricked Sarah's eyes, but they were good tears. Tears of gratitude and love and the profound relief of being truly understood. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Jake replied, and then he kissed her, soft and sweet, with Mary giggling between them. As they broke apart, Sarah noticed a familiar figure walking up the lane. Emma, her sister, had arrived early for the wedding preparations, and behind her came Robert and their 2 children, laden with suitcases and wedding gifts. "Sarah!" Emma called out, dropping her bag and running the last few yards to embrace her sister. "Oh, look at, you look wonderful." And Sarah did look wonderful. The hollow-eyed, frightened woman who had fled into the storm 6 months ago had been replaced by someone radiant with health and happiness. Her hair shone in the sunlight, her skin had lost its pallor, and her eyes sparkled with life and purpose. "And this must be Mary," Emma continued, reaching for her niece. "Oh, she's beautiful. She looks just like you did at that age." As the families mingled in the yard, Jake found himself marveling at how full his life had become. The house that had stood empty for so many years now rang with laughter and conversation. The rooms that had echoed with loneliness were filled with the sounds of daily life. Mary's babbling, Sarah's singing, the scratch of her pen as she worked on her correspondence late into the evening. That night, after Emma's family had been settled in the guest room and Mary had been put to bed, Sarah and Jake sat on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear spring sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that storm hadn't come?" Sarah asked, her head resting on Jake's shoulder. "Sometimes," Jake admitted. "But then I remember that you were already planning to leave before the storm hit. You would have found your way to freedom somehow. Maybe. But I don't think I would have found my way to you." Jake pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I don't know about that. I have a feeling we were meant to find each other somehow." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the night. Owls calling from the barn, cattle settling down for the evening, the distant howl of a coyote somewhere on the plains. "Jake," Sarah said eventually, "what do you think about expanding the ranch?" He looked at her curiously. "What kind of expansion?" "I've been thinking about the women who've contacted Mrs. Mills. Some of them have nowhere to go while they're waiting for their divorces to be finalized. What if we could offer them a place to stay? A working ranch where they could learn skills, earn money, be safe while they rebuild their lives?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering the idea. It would mean more work, more responsibility, more risk, but it would also mean more purpose, more opportunity to make a real difference. "It's a big undertaking," he said finally. "I know, and I know it would change everything about our quiet life here." "Yes," Jake agreed. "It would." He paused, then smiled. "When do we start?" Sarah lifted her head to look at him, her eyes bright with excitement and love. "You mean it?" "I mean it. This ranch has been a place of healing for us. Maybe it's time to share that with others who need it." As if summoned by their conversation, Mary's cry drifted from the house. Not distressed, just awake and wanting attention. They rose together to tend to her, And as they walked into their warm, lamp-lit home, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived with purpose. The Cor, woman who had once fled into a snowstorm with nothing but hope and desperation, had become someone who could offer both to others. The lonely rancher who had wrapped strangers in his coat had discovered that the greatest warmth came from a heart open to love. And Mary, who had begun life in fear and uncertainty, would grow up knowing that love looked like gentle hands and patient voices, like parents who chose each other every day and built something beautiful together. Outside, the wind swept across the Wyoming plains, carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers. It was the same wind that had driven snow and danger 6 months ago, but now it brought only the promise of growing things, of new beginnings, of hope taking root in fertile ground. In the house, as Sarah fed Mary and Jake banked the fire for the night, they talked quietly about their plans. The wedding next month, the commission work, the possibility of expanding the ranch into a refuge for women in need. Each dream, built on the last, creating a future that neither could have imagined alone, but that together seemed not only possible, but inevitable. When they finally went to bed, with Mary sleeping peacefully in her crib nearby, Sarah lay in Jake's arms and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From terror to trust, from desperation to hope, from survival to purpose. It had been a transformation as dramatic as winter giving way to spring. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Jake murmured, already half asleep. "For wrapping us in your coat that night, for giving us shelter, for showing us what love really looks like." Jake's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for trusting me with your hearts." Outside their window, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, and somewhere in the distance, a new foal took its first steps on unsteady legs, learning to trust the world that had seemed so frightening just moments before. It was, Sarah thought as she drifted off, to sleep, the most beautiful sound in the world, the sound of new life finding its courage, ready to embrace whatever adventures lay ahead.